advantage and comparative advantage. There are two types of problems that you have to deal with opportunity cost, comparative, and absolute advantage. There are output problems and there are input problems. And the reason that they matter is that you can put different numbers in the numerators and denominators. The process is pretty much the same. The question is which number goes on top, which number goes on the bottom, and that's why you have to worry about which one's an input problem and which one's an output problem. Process is basically the same. You're always asking the question, what do I have to give up in order to get one more of something? So this problem is looking at acres to produce 100 bushels of two different agricultural products, corn and rice. And we have two nations, and they could produce different amounts. What's different here? The amount of resource used or the amount of corn produced?
The amount of corn produced.
Well, it says 100 bushels.
Oh.
So what's different? The resource, the number of acres needed to produce that 100 bushels of corn or 100 bushels of rice. So this is an input problem because the thing that's different is the resource. So make sure you read your question carefully. So input problems follow the following pattern. The way you determine opportunity cost on an input problem is the opportunity cost of choice A is going to be the amount of resources used to produce choice A divided by the amount of resources used to produce choice B. So here for India, for every bushel of corn that India produces, India is going to need to give up 9 corn to 3 rice, so 9/3. So 1 corn costs India 9/3 of a bushel of rice. And it's going to be the reciprocal for the rice. So 1 rice for India equals 3/9 corn. It's always expressed in terms of the other possible product. On the other hand, China, for every bushel of corn that China produces, 1 bushel of corn is going to be equal to 8 halves of a bushel of rice. And every bushel of rice that China produces will be worth, or will cost, 2/8 of a bushel of corn. So now we have to figure absolute and comparative advantage, because that's how these problems usually show up. Absolute advantage means that I do it better. If it's an input problem, it means I do it with fewer resources. So who uses the least amount of resources to produce corn? Is it India or is it China? It's China, because China uses 8 acres of land to produce their 100 bushels of corn, and India uses 9 acres of land to produce 100 bushels of corn. So China has the absolute advantage, maybe S-O-L-U-T-E, has the absolute advantage in corn. India may have an absolute advantage in rice, but we don't know yet. Let's analyze it. So India takes 3 acres of land to produce 100 bushels of corn, and China can do it with 2. So who does it with fewer resources? China, again. So China also has an absolute advantage in rice. Okay, so we know that China does it better, but we don't know who does it cheaper. And that's what the question of comparative advantage is about. Who does it at the lowest opportunity cost? And anytime you're calculating this, you know anytime you're calculating this, you know that if you have comparative advantage in one thing, the other guy has to have comparative advantage in the other. You can have absolute advantage in both, but you cannot have comparative advantage in both. So if we're looking at this, taking a look at this, 9/3 rice would be 3 rice, correct? Have I got my math wrong? So every bushel of corn that India produces costs 3 bushels of rice. And every bushel of corn that China produces costs 8 halves of rice, or 4 bushels of rice. So 1 bushel of corn costs India 3 bushels of rice, and 1 bushel of corn costs China 4 bushels of rice. Who does it cheaper? India. So India has comparative advantage here, which means they should specialize in production of corn. And we're going to have India, it's costing 1/3 of a bushel of corn for every bushel of rice, and it's costing China 1/4 of a bushel of corn for every bushel of rice, 1/4 smaller than 1/3. So we know, even if we hadn't already done it by process of elimination, that China will have comparative advantage in production of rice. So we know that India should specialize in producing corn and trade for rice, and that China should specialize in producing rice and trade for corn. Absolute and comparative advantage. Now the other pattern that you could get is the output pattern. And what matters here is the resource is the same, but the result is different. So we got 2 hunters here. Ignore any like game permit issues, because these harvest numbers are way too high to be legal. But we've got 2 hunters out there. We've got Bob and Carol. And Bob and Carol are going hunting for moose and caribou. They have 1 day to go hunting. And if Carol goes moose hunting, she's going to catch 4 moose in that day. She does nothing but hunt for moose. She'll catch 4 moose in a day. Or she could hunt for caribou, and she would catch 6 caribou in the day. Bob, on the other hand, must be like master hunter, because Bob could catch 24 moose or harvest 12 caribou, assuming that they specialize. So the pattern here, this is the Oreo pattern. Output, Oreo, start with the same letter. And if you remember, the side of an Oreo looks, it's got the pattern of cookie, cream, cookie. So the pattern we're looking for here to determine opportunity cost. Opportunity cost for 1 unit of A, 1 unit of A, is going to be the amount of B that we could produce divided by the amount of A that we could produce. So A, B, A. Opportunity cost of A is B divided by A. So if Carol is going to catch moose, we're going to look at caribou divided by moose. So 1 moose for Carol equals 6 caribou divided by 4 moose. On the other hand, if we're going to catch caribou, 1 caribou is going to be equal to 4 moose divided by 6 caribou. Bob, on the other hand, master hunter. Bob, if Bob goes out and catches moose, 1 moose for Bob is going to be equal to 12 caribou divided by 24 moose. And 1 caribou for Bob will be equal to 24 moose divided by 12 caribou. So, absolute advantage. Who's the better moose hunter? Bob. Bob is the better moose hunter. So he has absolute advantage in moose hunting. Who's the better caribou hunter? Bob. Bob just has to make the rest of us look bad. So Bob's got absolute advantage in both moose and caribou, but he doesn't have comparative advantage in both. This one's actually a little bit easier than the other one because you have numbers that are less than 1 compared to numbers that are greater than 1. And we don't need to simplify at all in order to figure out who's got comparative advantage. So if we're just looking at moose hunting, the moose that Carol caught cost 6/4 of a caribou. So it's costing her more than 1 caribou. But the moose that Bob catches is 12/24, less than 1. So who's doing it cheaper? The person who gives up more than 1 caribou or the person who gives up less than 1 caribou? Less than 1 caribou. So turns out that Bob has comparative advantage in moose. He does it cheaper. On the other hand, Carol. If Carol specializes in caribou, she's only giving up 4/6 of a moose, or less than 1 moose. But if Bob specializes in caribou, he's giving up 24/12 of a moose, or more than 1 caribou. Sorry, more than 1 moose. For every caribou that Bob catches, he's giving up more than 1 moose. So in this case, who has the comparative advantage in catching caribou? Carol. Carol has comparative advantage in catching caribou. So who should be the caribou hunter? Carol. Okay, Carol should spend all of her time catching caribou. And Bob should spend his time catching moose. And in fact, if you wanted to have 12 caribou, what Bob could actually do is end up, Carol could spend her entire day catching caribou. Bob could spend half the day catching caribou. And they would still end up with 12 caribou. And Bob could then spend the other half of the day going after moose, and they would end up with 12 moose and 12 caribou, which is a production possibility. It's impossible for both of them now with current productions. Individually, Bob could not have both 12 moose and 12 caribou. So they can both consume beyond their production possibilities curve if they specialize in trade.